So it's my pleasure to welcome today Reverend Rebecca Voelkel. Rebecca is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. She's the program director for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Institute for Welcoming Resources, a national ecumenical collaboration of the Welcoming Church movement. Before coming to the task force, Rebecca served as the interim national coordinator for the United Church of Christ Coalition for LGBT Concerns, as pastor of Spirit of the Lakes UCC, and as program staff for the Center for the Prevention of Sexual and Domestic Violence. She's the author of Preventing Sexual Abuse, a course of study for teenagers, as well as numerous articles and sermons that have appeared in journals such as Spirit Currents, the Journal of Religion and Abuse, and Parenting for Peace and Justice. She's a graduate of Earlham College and Yale Divinity School and is currently working toward a Doctor of Ministry at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Voelkel.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I have to admit that I'm a bit nervous about gathering with you all this afternoon as a faith leader in this predominantly secular, pro-queer environment. But one of the affirmations I hold is that part of the challenge for us as queer and allied folks involved in the movement for social justice is that we bring our whole selves to the conversation, not to proselytize or try and convert, but to offer new perspectives and dimensions that might not have been present had our particular vision and lens and experience not been present. So I'm going to start with a bit of my own story that's particular, concrete, and specific, not to proselytize, but to share with you who I am. Then I'm going to share a bit about the pro-LGBT religious movement in this country. And then these two pieces will form a kind of context into which my colleague and friend Lisa Weiner-Mahfouz and I will share some of the findings of a study that we did called The Time to Build Up, which is an analysis of the Proposition 8 campaign and experience in California in 2008. And finally, Lisa and I are going to take some time to talk together with you about some of the challenges and opportunities for doing queer work that seeks to bridge the secular religious divide, if in fact that divide exists. So, in a gesture toward bridging the secular and religious, let me tell you how my life was changed by television. So much of what I'm going to share with you today began with Little House on the Prairie. Do you remember that show from the 1970s, anybody? Yes? It was set in Minnesota and South Dakota and chronicled the life of a young woman, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was played by Melissa Gilbert. Well, one of the early telltale signs of my orientation was an enormous crush on Laura Ingalls Wilder. I watched it faithfully as each week my shero tackled yet another daunting task of life on the prairie. In 1983, Melissa Gilbert starred in a made-for-TV movie called Choices of the Heart. Choices of the Heart shared the story of Jean Donovan, who was one of the U.S. churchwomen who was raped and murdered in El Salvador in 1980. She was killed by the U.S.-backed Salvadoran death squads. And I have to tell you that movie changed the course of my life. All of the admiration and love I felt for Melissa Gilbert as Laura Ingalls Wilder, I transferred to Jean Donovan. And it led me to read absolutely every book I could find on her. Biographies, books on Archbishop Oscar Romero, whose death we are mourning this weekend. He had been killed about 9 months prior to Jean's death, and it had, for those 9 months, his life and witness really shaped her ministry. And I also read all kinds of books from the Latin American liberation theology context. Jean's life story and subsequent consciousness I gained from the passion I felt for her led me to sign the Pledge of Resistance. The Pledge of Resistance was something in the 1980s whose signatories promised to resist if the U.S. ever invaded El Salvador. That led me to start a chapter of Amnesty International in my high school, host a conference on the children of war, and to participate in the so-called sanctuary movement. And in 1987, as a first-year student in college, it led me to participate in an accompaniment trip to El Salvador. As I have reflected on all of this, I'm aware that, at least in my own life, my passions have an expansive quality to them. That is to say that my love of another person is connected to my love of their life circumstances, and that these are connected to my deep desire to make this kind of love and justice in the world. For me, desire and passion are deeply personal, but they have led me over and over again to desire and passion and love and justice out in the world. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think that this is one of the particular gifts that the LGBT movement can share with the larger faith movement and justice movements. One of my most profound experiences of this expansive quality of desire and passion was that trip I made to El Salvador in 1987 as part of the accompaniment movement. Let me just tell you a bit about that as some more context setting. The accompaniment movement grew out of the desire on the part of North Americans to support the efforts of Salvadoran refugees returning home from Mesa Grande and other refugee camps outside of El Salvador. The refugees had originally fled in 1983 in the wake of Operation Phoenix. It's interesting to note that Operation Phoenix has been the name of Army operations in Vietnam, in El Salvador, and other parts of the world. But the motto of the Operation Phoenix in El Salvador was, "The guerrillas are like the fish, the people like the sea. If we dry up the sea, we can find the fish." So the strategy was to drop literally thousands of tons of bombs on the Salvadoran countryside and then have National Guardsmen move in to wreak havoc, terror, and death. In the early 1980s, Santa Marta had been a village of about 4,000 people. Operation Phoenix killed about 3,000 of those folks, and the remaining 1,000 fled into Honduras and lived there in a refugee camp for over 4 years. In October of 1987, the survivors took diapers, towels, and anything else that was white and could be held up as a flag of peace and walked back into El Salvador, to the place that had been their village. There, they were joined by North Americans whose presence was meant to keep the Salvadoran army from killing the villagers, because the army didn't want the U.S. population to be made aware of what was happening in El Salvador. They'd learned their lesson in 1980 when Jean Donovan and her 3 colleagues were killed. The U.S. had cut off aid for a number of months. So anyway, I was part of that delegation that spent a week in Santa Marta over Christmas in 1987. During that trip, I asked one of the women how it was that she had come to El Salvador and how it was that she had been able to come back to El Salvador and protest the government and not be terrified. In her response, she said to me, "I have lost 5 children to this civil war. One of them, my oldest son, I witnessed being tortured to death. I have been able to survive because for me, I know that in Jesus Christ, God knows in God's body what it means to be tortured to death. So my son did not die alone, but being held in God's arms. And in the resurrection, God has said once and for all that life and love are stronger than death. So it doesn't matter what they try to do to me. Even if they kill me, I know that God will resurrect me, and that makes me powerful. Now, I have to tell you that I am a double PK. That means that both of my parents, can I hear a helper, Lord? Both of my parents are pastors. And I have heard a lot of sermons over the course of my life. Many of them were brilliant. But no one has spoken more powerfully about what the meaning of God in their life is than that fearless, powerful Salvadoran woman. And to her, I owe the debt of my faith. Her words taught me that faith is not something to be practiced once or twice a week as an optional activity, but is instead, at least for me, necessary for survival. Furthermore, faith is that which compels its adherents to act in the world to make it more like God would have it to be, just and abundant and joyous. When I returned home from El Salvador, I continued to do a lot of work with the Central American Solidarity Movement. I learned Spanish. I went to Nicaragua and Mexico and lived in Christian-based communities, and I began a formal study of liberation theologies. All of it remains etched in my person and continues to shape my ministry. One of the ways my Central American experience continues to inform and inspire me is that it was that context that emboldened me to come out as a lesbian. Because I was interacting with women and men who were fearless, I was called to face into my own fears. And at the time, my deepest fear was my own internalized homo and transphobia. Although I grew up in a context in the United Church of Christ in which both of my parents were very supportive of LGBTQI folks, I knew still that there were many, many barriers that would stand in my way if I were to name both my growing awareness of my own sexual orientation and my desire to pursue ordained ministry. But the words kept coming back to me. Faith isn't a convenience. It's necessary for survival. If that were true, I was going to have to both accept the call that God had placed on my heart to be both lesbian and that of loving women. Now, I share all of this with you because for me, given my own life experiences and the debt that I owe to those who have embodied God for me, it's impossible to separate my call to ministry, my coming out as a lesbian, and my understanding of God's desire to have us participate in making the world more like God would have it to be. And the fact is that in such a world, justice is about nonviolence, and it's about an abundance of food, and it's about universal access to health care, and it's about creating a space so that the gifts of all of us are shared, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Other language for this justice work might be intersectional, and Lisa and I will delve into a little bit about that in a bit. But the point is that from my life experience, all of the justice work happens. The strengths, the oppressions, we have to be working together. Okay. So that's a little bit of a taste of where I come from. I want to just share a bit about the pro-LGBT religious movement and organizing before I invite Lisa to come up and share a bit about herself before we share some insights on Proposition 8. So religious organizing, in a word, I would say that it's deeply complex. Without getting, hopefully, too far into the weeds, I just want to share a few reflections. Because religion is so deeply entwined with culture and race and ethnicity, religious organizing requires that you pay a lot of attention to a lot of moving parts. This is one of the things that our secular colleagues often are baffled by. There is no such thing as a monolithic religious voice or position. This is true both for the anti-LGBT religious leaders and for the work that's done in the midst of and on behalf of LGBT people and families. For example, working within the Reformed Jewish community is very different than working within the Orthodox Jewish community. And working with Pentecostal Christianity is very much different than working within mainline Protestant Christianity. But even within mainline Protestant, Lutherans have a long history of hospital and nursing home work. But they have to stretch quite a bit to do things that are more social justice oriented. While for many within the United Church of Christ, social justice work is absolutely seen as a natural outgrowth of being a religious person. Now, I share this not to get your defenses up if you're a Reformed Jew or a Lutheran, but to make the point that cultural competency is extremely important within religious organizing in general, and especially when it comes to pro-LGBT religious work. I just want to give you a couple of statistics. There are over 100 pro-LGBT national religious organizations and traditions. And they are within every single religious tradition you can think of. There are at least 2 or 3 different national groups, Al-Fatiha and the LGBT Muslim Working Group, working within Islam. There's Gay Dharma and the Pagan Alliance, the Institute for Judaism and Sexual Orientation, Genderfold Alliance, and one that you probably know about, but particularly in this part of the country, there's an organization called Room for All that works primarily within the Reformed Church of America, but also a bit within the Christian Reformed Church. And literally dozens and dozens more. Likewise, there's over 50 years of pro-LGBT religious organizing that has worked both on intra-religious questions around LGBT folks, as well as advocating in the kind of public square, if you will, on pro-LGBT issues. For example, there's some great stuff that's been done recently. I would encourage you to look at the LGBT Religious Archives Network. It's a great website, lgbtran.org. And was in 1963 and 1964 in San Francisco, there was a group of mostly Protestant and Jewish leaders who formed the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. And they worked with the Daughters of Bilitis and other pro-LGBT organizations to try and repeal California's sodomy laws. And another sort of intra-religious, example is the United Church of Christ ordained its first out gay man as a pastor in 1973. So I just say that to say that, as we talk about the kind of partnering between religious and secular work, there is just a rich, complex history and a lot of fantastic folks out there doing the work. The primary work that I do as part of the Institute for Welcoming Resources at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force is to kind of convene and strategize and work in 3 concentric circles of leaders. The first is that there are about 11 different pro-LGBT welcoming church programs. And we convene twice a year an organization called the Welcoming Church Program Leaders. And they are groups, they're leaders of programs in denominations where it's possible to have a welcoming congregation, a congregation that's gone through a welcoming process, and stay within that denomination. So, there are Room for All congregations within the Reformed Church in America, and More Light Presbyterian congregations in Presbyterian Church USA, those kinds of folks. The second circle is the Bishops and Elders Council, which is a very intentional attempt to convene folks across the Christian spectrum, evangelical, Pentecostal, Protestant, and Roman Catholic leadership, to try and really bring a new voice around Christianity. And sometimes folks give me some pushback about why is it that the majority of your work is within Christianity. And, you know, I often say it's not the pagan alliance that is causing problems for us in secular society, that Christianity is the primary problem. And so there's a lot of work within Christianity. And then the third circle is the National Religious Leadership Roundtable. And Lisa and I are going to talk a little bit about them. But it's a multi-faith collaboration, and as I say, with folks from every single religious tradition you can think of. So I just want to talk about one of the key assumptions that we use in our organizing is that when we're doing work in religious communities, it's really, really important to use, quote-unquote, indigenous leadership. I don't come from a Pentecostal tradition, and so it's not going to be helpful if I'm a messenger in the midst of a Pentecostal context. And so I work very closely with Bishop Yvette Flunder, who's a leader in a pro-LGBT Pentecostal movement called the Fellowship, just to give one example. But this insight of indigenous leadership is balanced with the fact that we often have more in common across our religious traditions when we're doing pro-LGBT work than we do with our sort of anti-LGBT co-religionists. And so that means that this sort of commonality and desire to be active around LGBT issues often means that there are all kinds of experiences and richness that we can learn that have worked in other traditions that are very much can give us ideas and insights for action within our own tradition. And finally, one of the most fun things, and we're going to talk a little bit about Prop 8, and there were some really painful and difficult things about that, but one of the positive pieces was that the multi-faith collaboration around LGBT issues is one of the most fun things that any of us gets to do. Okay, well, I've sort of tipped my hand in some of the things that we're going to share in a time to build up. But before we get there, I want to just introduce my colleague, Lisa Weiner-Mahfouz, with whom we've been doing, 4 or 5 years together. And much of what we're going to share next is going to be kind of coming out of some of the work that we've done together. So I'd like to invite her up to share a bit about herself.
Oh, I'll just go
over here. All right.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was beautiful. Really. Thank you for sharing so much about yourself. Am I live? Okay, good. So my name is Lisa Weiner-Mahfouz, and I first met Rebecca when we were colleagues at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and we're going to talk about some of the work that we've done together. But I want to say a little bit about what brings me to this conversation and to this work, and then we'll present the findings. In some ways, I was probably came out of the womb a little bit prepared to do this work and didn't know it at the time. I come from a multi-faith, multiracial family. My father is an Ashkenazi Jew, and my mother is a Syrian Muslim Arab. And so I grew up in a Semitic context. Neither of my parents practiced Christianity. I was raised Jewish. My mother converted to Judaism, actually. And so a lot of that experience and their struggle, it was a struggle for them. They were in constant conflict around the issues of faith and race in our family. And yet my grandfathers, who both were immigrants to this country, were the best of friends. And they found that in the Old Testament, they found a bond with each other around being Semites and coming from the Middle East that really made them feel more like cousins and brothers than actual, political enemies or some sort of contradiction. So for me, a lot of my work has been built on their legacy and also the learnings of my parents who were in constant conflict around this. So when I met Rebecca, I thought, gosh, working with somebody who actually has a collar and is deeply rooted in her own faith and is actually clergy was a little scary, because Christianity is something that has been very hard as a Semite, somebody who's grown up as a Semite, to be in a Christian-dominated culture and country. I thought, this is a difficult partnership. But as we talked about the fallout from Prop 8, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, and about our approaches to movement building, both in faith communities as well as in communities of color, we found a lot of common ground and found a really unique partnership, which we're going to talk a little bit about here. So that's what brings me to the work. I don't think that our work is easy. We've had some very intense conversations, some hard times, and yet also a commitment to going deeper, because there's something in this secular religious partnership and also this Semitic and non-Semitic, I guess, Christian relationship that I think we have both gained a lot from in terms of our work and our relationship. So that's a little bit about what brings me. And do you want to say a little bit about A Time to Build Up?
Yeah.
What laid the context for that, and then we'll go into the findings.
Then we're going to go into the findings, yes.
Yeah.
So I think most of us know that in 2008, we saw a pretty bitter fight in California around the issues of marriage equality in the Proposition 8 struggle. I think folks know that about $80 million was spent, ridiculous amounts of time and energy, some of the most horrible ads that have been aired, spewing lies about LGBT folks. And following its passage, racist vitriol, really, was spewed from the mouths of LGBT folks, blaming the passage of Proposition 8 on African American folks who had, supposedly come out in large numbers to vote for President Obama. And in addition to this, there were some really painful experiences during the campaign between folks who were working for the No on 8 campaign and folks in the religious community who were attempting to do some anti-Proposition 8 organizing. So as a way to kind of debrief, heal from, make sure that this never happened again, kind of a spirit, the Arcus Foundation approached the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and asked if we would do some analysis and assessment. And so in order to do that, we convened about 35 pro-LGBT, multi-faith leaders and activists, some from California, some national, but all of whom had worked on the Proposition 8 struggle. And we did a kind of pre-survey, and then we did a day-and-a-half-long convening, and then out of that we published a finding called A Time to Build Up. And I would say that, I would just make one side note, and that is that the Center for American Progress also did a similar study of kind of debriefing the 2004 election here in Michigan. And actually some of the findings that we're going to share, it was very interesting. We released the studies at almost the same time, and Arcus funded both of them. But I just want to say that the findings about what happened here in Michigan are almost identical to our findings. So I hope you'll find some useful things in that. So let me start. We're going to kind of go back and forth and try and kind of lift up these findings. And I would just say that if you have interest, it's a downloadable document at welcomingresources.org or on the Arcus Foundation's website. But we're just going to kind of take you through and say a few things about what we learned from that experience, and then talk about, I think, how it has helped us. Now, you would think that perhaps that seems blatantly obvious. But instead of, blaming African Americans for the defeat, the primary research has shown that the number one indicator of how folks voted on Proposition 8 was weekly religious attendance. It was also tied to party affiliation and age. But religion is up in, and the religious opposition around supporters of Proposition 8 used the networks, the culture, the churches, used the sort of delivery mechanisms of religious organizations in order to get Proposition 8 passed. But the piece that, and therefore, it's in some ways it seems patently obvious that having pro-LGBT religious folks engaged in, trying to defeat Proposition 8, that seems like it might be obvious. But in fact, part of what happens in the midst of campaigns is, and I'm editorializing, we sometimes lose our minds. And they did some polling, and this is part of the problem when we get into narrow sort of campaign thinking. They did polling that showed that the movable middle, which was the folks that they were solely focusing on, didn't want to see religious people fighting. So because of that, their strategy was to silence and muzzle pro-LGBT religious folks. And so we tried to do a couple of things organized, and we were literally told several different times by campaign folks, no, you cannot speak as religious folks against Proposition 8. That's one piece. And then related to that is, so instead of that sort of thinking.
Can I just say,
sure.
Ask you one thing? Could you flush out the fact that this is a common pattern?
Yeah. Well, again, so what happened here in Michigan in 2004, this is the kind of thing that happens time and time again. Mm-hmm. And if religious folks are invited to be part of some campaigns, and I'm using really sort of blanket statements, and I have worked on numbers of campaigns, and campaign organizing is extraordinarily important. So I hope, don't get me wrong, but it is a typical experience mm-hmm. that, and we'll talk about this a bit, but that religious folks are instruments of campaigns as opposed to co-architects of. And so, a lot of the conversation was, okay, you can talk as, you can show up in your collar, but you can't use any religious language. You have to talk about fairness and the sort of talking points that the campaign had come up with. And so this is a very, very common problem around campaigns. So go for it.
I actually think you have the next one.
No, those are the first two. So
those are the first two. Great. Excellent.
Yeah.
You just collapsed them. Excellent. Great. So the next one is campaigns as a critical component to movement building. And I actually call this one the campaign for what? What are we actually trying to do? What is the goal of not just the goal of the campaign, but the strategy for actually building long-term community building, long-term infrastructure in a community? And often, in not just in the LGBT community, but also across movements, the campaign becomes the sole focus. And Rebecca alluded to this a bit. It becomes the sole focus. And the campaign becomes the vehicle for actually challenging the policy, the issue, whatever it is. But there's no thinking about how the campaign becomes something that actually builds up the community long term and creates more interconnectedness in the community to fight battles longer term. So it's not just about where we are now with Prop 8, it's about what comes after Prop 8, what comes after that. How do we build the kind of infrastructure that creates that kind of sustainability? And often when we build campaigns in a movement context, we don't ask those questions. We just build the campaign and focus on the issue at hand rather than the long-term nature of what we're trying to do. So that's the first finding here. And I think in a pro-religious LGBT context, this is critical because, often, and in communities of color, is that often the way we do campaign organizing is to actually embed it in the fabric and long-term work of our community. It doesn't become a separate thing. It becomes it's part of the fabric of. So that's the first finding. Did you want to
say one other thing? Yeah. And some of the I think technical language of the Grassroots Policy Institute has a really lovely sort of three faces of power. Do you want to?
Yeah, actually, that was one of the next findings, which is, and it builds on the next finding around cultural context. There are three faces of building a movement, and they're not in a linear order. The first is base building, and that is where we define the we, where we actually begin to find our people, defined based on either identity or an issue. issue. So think about the last wave of movement building, which is a 30-year cycle, actually. Movement historians have found that movements move in 30-year waves. That the last frame was around rights, and a lot of the way civil rights, individual rights, etc., and a lot of the way that we defined the we and built the base was based on identity. The National Organization for Women, the National Center for Transgender Equality, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. We found the we based on identity, and then what we did was when we found our people based on identity, we built infrastructure. We built organizations and institutions that actually not only represented the we, but began to take on organizing and campaigns and things like that based on the we. And so then you have organizations. And then the next piece of movement building is the mass mobilization. So at the height of the civil rights movement, the height of that movement was the March on Washington in 1963. That was the culmination of not only base building and institutions coming together, but mass mobilization. It was the largest march on Washington ever to date at that time, and it was the biggest collection of the we, the biggest demonstration of the we since prior to that point. So that's how movements move in 30-year cycles, and it takes actually doing the base building and the institution building to get to that mass mobilization where collective consciousness begins to grow around a movement and people begin to identify with the frame. And in the last wave, it was rights. Did you want to add more to that?
Well, the only other thing I would say is the importance of when we do campaigns being this mass mobilization, being very intentional, to your point, that, we may have a deadline of election day in November, but if we're using every opportunity to kind of share our view of how the world ought to be, and that's one of the pieces, that's the sort of sharing of the worldview that's so important that even if we lose on election day, we have used every opportunity to get in people's imagination how the world ought to be. And that's when we're short-sighted in our campaigns that we can often shoot ourselves in the foot. And one of the things that religious folks do is we tend to spend a lot of time talking about how the world ought to be. That's part of the sort of inspiration and dreaming that religious folks tend to do. And so that particular piece can be in a special role that religious folks can bring real strength to the campaign work that we're doing. So
absolutely.
Sorry.
And the other thing that I would add to this too, Rebecca, is that the dissemination of the worldview is critical because the reason why the March on Washington in '63 was so powerful is because the worldview that got projected around the we was big enough and broad enough to be inclusive. And so it resonated broadly across communities and across issues and identities because the we was framed in a broad enough way to be able to do that, which is what caught the collective consciousness and passion of so many people. And so often in campaigns, the we is defined in such a small way that it doesn't resonate. And we found with Prop 8, because the we was defined so narrowly, it didn't speak to communities of color and it didn't speak to communities of faith at all. So, and then there's a whole conversation of who gets to define the we and how much power they have to define the we. And in the case of Prop 8, it was a very narrowly defined campaign management team that came up with the talking points and had the power to define who got to speak on the part of the campaign and who did not. And it builds on the last point, which is grounding campaigns in cultural competency. And that connects to the we, it also connects to the frame, and it also connects to who has the power. And one of the things that is critical around campaign organizing is that, and it gets to your point about indigenous leadership, is that grounding a campaign in the communities themselves and not having a cookie-cutter approach that says this is the way that the campaign has to roll out and has to work in each and every community and there's only one way to do it is actually when we shoot ourselves in the foot. And I think we have found that there are ways to actually do a campaign that has a long-term impact, that builds community long-term, that has a broad way of defining the we, we, and that actually grounds itself in the real lived experiences of people across communities without saying, you must do it this way and there's only one way to do it. And so those are some of the key findings around this movement building work.
The only thing I want to add, which is the final sort of part of this first finding around religious leaders, is, Lisa talked about these kind of movement waves, and we are still in the sort of nadir of the last progressive wave and the peak of the current conservative wave. And part of what's really important, particularly around Proposition 8, but in terms of this suggesting a kind of taking race and faith and cultural and context seriously, is that the radical right and the radical religious right employed a very, very intentional wedge strategy. And in the early 1990s, I don't know if you remember the film Gay Rights, Special Rights, but there was a very intentional strategy that they have employed to really draw a wedge between African American civil rights and the civil rights movement and LGBT civil rights. And part of the tragedy of the post-Prop 8 experience was that the LGBT community played right into that wedge. And part of the importance, particularly given the role of African American religious leaders and the way in which the right has deployed particular African American religious leaders against LGBT rights, is the vast majority of African American civil rights leaders, religious leaders, are pro-LGBT folks. And if we are doing our organizing in ways that further try and disconnect, and I'm not talking about appropriating the civil rights movement, but I'm talking about doing organizing that takes seriously the cultural competence in different religious communities and different communities of color, that there's a way that you can be doing intersectional organizing that does not play into that hand and further the wedge between African American civil rights movement and the LGBT rights movement.
Absolutely.
So I think before we move to the second point, I'm sensing us, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, people are yawning. I have no idea if it's because it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or we're boring you out of your skulls. So what I'm wondering, if before we move to the next point, if we might just take a couple of questions. Yes. We're sort of talking in big theory stuff, but how is this landing on you? Yes, Colette.
Well, I'll take a look, and then certainly, because you have a lot of knowledge, I'll do broad brush strokes. This is often true with all of the campaigns across movements. I've seen many of them, including in the LGBT movement. It is usually the organizations that have the most money in the state, as well as nationally. It is a very complex dance and power negotiation that happens between some of the statewide organizations that are most powerful and well-funded in the state versus the national players. Sometimes the national folks have to fight their way in, and they do. Sometimes they're invited in. And so there's that dance that happens across movements. And then usually what happens is the folks that have the most funding form the decision-making body of that campaign and decide who's calling the shots. They often then go and hire a campaign organizer or director that directs the day-to-day operations. But it's usually a very small group of people, very well funded, and usually, not exclusively, but usually in the LGBT context, predominantly white, predominantly male, and very well funded. So,
I don't think I have much more to say.
Say more in the Prop 8, because you were close in on that.
My understanding is that the kind of the steering committee that met was that if you could bring $1 million or more to the table, those were the folks who were on the steering committee.
Yeah. And funders play a large role in that too. Often in the LGBT context, the major funders will also drive money to particular organizations and have them be the representatives at the table around this. So what you'll see is the coffers for some organizations really going through the roof at the time of a campaign because the funders will handpick who they want to hold that money and how they want them to play in the campaign.
So please go ahead.
Just to bring up that same thing with finances, have you seen that CD, The Mormon Proposition? How they show it, how the Mormon Church pretty much almost single-handedly financed.
Yes.
Yeah, the comment is that, you know, on the pro Prop 8, the anti-LGBT side, there's a lot of the funding came from the Mormon Church, a lot of the funding came from the Catholic Church, and again, it's you know, I can't emphasize enough the way in which religious folks were architects of the pro Prop 8 anti-LGBT stuff, and religious folks were not at the table at all on the anti-Prop 8 pro-LGBT work. And, you know, given, you know, I'll just say one aside, and that is that we often talk about LGBT issues. There's kind of a three-pegged stool of support for anti-LGBT work. There is the sort of sin, sickness, and illegality. And we've done pretty well around the illegality question. You know, we've repealed most, you know, anti-sodomy laws, you know, less so around transgender stuff, but we're working, you know, and the sickness, you know, the APA and others, there's still an the gender dysphoria diagnosis in the DMS, whatever we are now, 6 or whatever the latest version is. But the peg that we have been unsuccessful or not as successful with is the sin peg.
That's right.
It is alive and well. And my you know, contention is that until we learn how to be doing our work that is transforming that sort of sin peg, we're going to continue to pour enormous amounts of resources and not get a lot of success. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jesse, one other? Yes.
So the 2 points or whatever that you're trying to get across to us is, one is whatever your campaign, whether you're on the right or the left or whatever, don't let the others define the we. You define your own, and we don't let someone else define it for you.
Well, I think what we're trying to get to is that the biggest, broadest, and most complex definition of the we is what allows us to reach mass, scope, and scale. That if we define the we in very narrow terms, we lose, like in Prop 8. When we define it in large terms, in complex and culturally competent ways, you have the March on Washington in 1963, which was mass mobilization.
So then the second part of that, don't define it or frame it as just a right for me, but it's a right for all of us.
Exactly. That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that.
You know, a concrete example that we actually talked with our colleagues in California during the Prop 8 campaign was, you know, it's not just kind of wealthy white folks that are impacted by marriage. You know, immigrants are impacted by marriage. Heterosexual people who are old, who have, you know, Social Security questions. And so that, you know, what if the question around marriage looked at all the people who are impacted by the laws around marriage? And what if your coalition was genuinely, you know, defining the we as broadly as possible? That's just a concrete example, you know, around that. Yeah.
Do you want me to say a little bit about the QEJ report around that,
Sure.
just as a concrete resource?
Yeah.
So there's a resource around this that may be interesting, and it's in the context of marriage, but there's a group that got together called Beyond Marriage back in early 2000, and it was a controversial group at the time, but what they did was they looked at all of the constitutional amendments that were passing around the country to ban marriage, and it was a very difficult and painful time whether you supported marriage in the LGBT community or not. Anytime discrimination gets enshrined in the Constitution against a community, it is extremely painful. So it was a very, very painful time for the whole community. But there was a group of folks that got together to write a paper called Beyond Marriage. And what they looked at is not necessarily around kind of bashing marriage and saying, no, the LGBT community should not work on it. But what they did was they said, what if we actually thought about the benefits of marriage, all of the economic benefits, and began to make an economic justice argument around marriage and made these benefits to marriage, economic benefits, accessible beyond just two people getting married. So, for example, in my case, my partner and I have been raising our godson since he was 2. He's now 12. In the beyond marriage world, if her and I were to marry or not, we would be able to extend our benefits to him because he is somebody that we define as family and have been raising. And at times where he has not had health insurance, we would have loved to have put him on our health insurance. However, in order to do that, in this configuration, the way the laws are currently written, his mother would have to give up her parental rights and we would have to become his legal guardians. So the beyond marriage reframes the issue and I think broadens the we.
What about if you don't look at it as just an economic issue, but when you say beyond marriage, I mean that triggers about the societal benefits. Is there less crime? Is there more, you know what I mean? All that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yep. And
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is beyond an LGBT context. What the paper argued is that grandparents who are raising their grandchildren should be able to extend benefits, health insurance, Social Security, their death benefits to whoever they're raising. So this is way beyond an LGBT issue. This is a community-based issue. You know. Marriages, but the beyond marriage paper, which you can get on the Queers for Economic Justice website, broadens it across communities and movements. It was really brilliantly done. So, and it broadens the we. So that's a good concrete example of it.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more question and then, oh yes.
Maybe this is a kind of a follow-up question about who was at the table in the campaigns. I didn't work so much on the 2004 one in Michigan, but in 2006 we had another proposal which was to eliminate affirmative action.
Yes. Yep.
Despite the fact that the incumbent governor was reelected, a Democrat, Granholm, and some people at the time would argue, and I would agree with this, that those who were doing the organizing around defeating that proposal were identified as too tightly attached to the Democratic Party. So I'm wondering how much partisan politics played into the campaign in California, and what's your experience with having autonomy from partisan politics around the issue?
I think it's a great question. And Lisa talked about the sort of dynamics of unless you can bring $1 million to the table, and then the campaign manager gets hired. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times the person they hire is someone who is actually comes out of a Democratic Party politics context and certainly doesn't know a lot about LGBT issues.
That's right.
And most certainly is not a movement builder. So I think those dynamics are very, very real. And part of I don't think actually we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it this morning or this afternoon, but part of the piece, I do a lot of work actually within religious communities, helping local congregations go through a welcoming and affirming process. And we do a lot of work around kind of deep listening and relationship building, particularly sort of the folks who are identified as different from us in whatever way you define that. And I really do think that there is, if you will, a very different orientation, that part of my critique of the way a lot of our campaigns are geared, and because the focus is so much on 50% plus one, and be damned if you happen to be part of that 49.999%. intent. And so part of, I think, what we're suggesting, and particularly those tactics don't work in the context of a religious community, because, even if, 50% plus one votes for a welcoming and affirming process, you still got to live with the 49.999. And the reality is we actually have to live in communities with one another post these elections. And so I really do think that we could go off on a whole, tangent on sort of the partisan bickering, but there is a sort of a way in which there's a level of broken relationship that I think this kind of movement building vision that we're offering really seeks to be a really different way of being in the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add one quick thing to this? Because I've said this in other places, and I think it's a really and written about this too, that the way that we've built movements over the last 30 years is that the template, kind of the cookie cutter for doing it, is the way we win. The way we win is to push the most marginalized bodies in our communities further to the margin, so that who gets to define the win, right, are the folks who have the most power in a community, and that winning is about getting quickly to the victory rather than building up, so that everybody, even if the win takes longer and is more complex to achieve, that in fact the boat rises for everybody. And the way that we build movements in this country is to actually push those bodies to the margin and to go for the simplest, easiest win, not the one that benefits the broadest breadth and depth of a community. And that's how we do it. And that is why the broken relationship happens often in campaigns and community organizing, because what ends up happening is so much of the community gets cut out from the work. Defining it, having the power in it, having some significant say in it, helping to shape it and do it. So I think that's
very helpful.
And so that leaves us with a challenge, which is what gets us to where we are. How do we do it differently?
Yeah. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about concretely sort of reflecting on Proposition 8, but then Lisa and I have an experience over the last couple of years just to share as a concrete example. Are we okay to move on? Is everybody still awake and with us? All right. Keep breathing and move around if you need to. So this seems self-evident coming out of what we just talked about, but that, the second key finding around the Proposition 8 experience was that it's just critical to develop deep and broad and long partnerships across what I think is a false dichotomy, but across secular religious lines in pro-LGBTQIA.
That would be us.
That'd be us, you and me.
That would be us.
And in order to do that, the kind of depth of relationship and the time that it takes. This is a movement building kind of experience, and that the kind of relationship building and accurate understanding is critical. So I talked earlier about this really complex religious world, and I think that we really need to be working with the complexity and the particularity of different religious communities, and there needs to be the kind of, we've talked about, there are some religious leaders who are really good leaders within their religious community, but frankly they suck at multi-faith work, for instance. Mm-hmm. They're just not bridge builders. And so part of doing this work is identifying not only folks who are leaders within their own community, but who have the both desire and the skill to be working across communities as well, because this needs to be done out of deep respect for one another. But also part of this work is that we have actually been working with some of our colleagues who primarily do the campaign side of things. And so really, building relationship with folks who are more the kind of campaign organizers and doing this kind of shared relationship building so that when it comes time to actually do the campaign, it's done in the context of relationship and with this kind of movement building piece. The other piece that's really important is the kind of preparatory work within religious communities is critically important. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, in California, there are 900 welcoming and affirming Christian and Jewish congregations. And so first of all, that is an incredible infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So, the work that has been done over the last 20 or 30 years, with individual transformation in every single one of those congregations has to continue. And just to give you some idea, there's been an exponential increase. Since 2005, we listed about 1,300 welcoming and affirming Christian and Unitarian congregations. And currently, we're a little bit above 4,000 welcoming and affirming Christian and Unitarian congregations. It really is an explosive movement. But I cannot overestimate how critically important it is to be doing that sort of organizing strategy in every single local congregation and really empowering folks to do that. But the piece that we learned in California was, of those 900 welcoming and affirming congregations, the Unitarians did a great job, 1 or 2 Episcopal congregations did a great job, 1 or 2 UCC congregations did a good job, a number of Jewish synagogues did a great job, but the vast majority of folks had done this great work around welcoming and affirming LGBT folks into their own congregation, but hadn't done, I talked earlier about the Lutherans, right? They do mercy and service projects really well. They don't do a lot of systemic justice projects really well. And so making the argument about why it is that being a welcoming and affirming congregation would mean that you would get engaged in a sort of secular political issue is a step that we really learned had not happened very broadly. So that's a project that we are engaged in right now, sort of doing some pilot projects in about 6 different states, trying to activate welcoming congregations for secular political work. And I talked about this earlier about the multi-faith collaboration. I just can't overemphasize how important that is. So I want to kind of shift now to a model that Lisa and I, coming out of Proposition 8, we thought, well, that was not a very fun experience. We can do better than that. So,
and we didn't at first.
We didn't. It really sucked at first. Really, really bad. But there's always so much to learn when you do something poorly the first time.
Yes, exactly.
So we, as I say, I work with these 100 pro-LGBT religious organizations. Lisa had, well, why don't you talk about the work that you were doing?
I was at the task force for 5 years, and so we had built a pretty intensive and broad-based racial justice, disability justice, and economic justice coalition, and a set of trainings and organizing projects around the country. And it was a really, it was a really intersectional collective of folks that was really had a worldview that was about broadening the we, and really trying to change the fact that the LGBT community, primarily in its infrastructure and in its base building, always kind of narrows the we. And so the strategy, the organizing and long-term movement building strategy of this group was to try to broaden the frame and broaden the we around the LGBT movement. And so we had 5 years of really incredible organizing projects together. And part of the collective was Queers for Economic Justice, the Audre Lorde Project, Southerners on New Ground, and then we formed a Disability Justice Collective, which Mia Mingus was part of. She'll be here next month, as well as a First Nations Two-Spirit Collective. And in the United States, there is no national umbrella that brings together disability justice activists in the queer movement, as well as First Nations Two-Spirit activists. So this was really a big opportunity to add to our LGBT infrastructure that expanded the we. So there was about 35 or 40 people involved in this effort, and from there, we actually teamed up with Rebecca's folks in the wake of Prop 8. Rebecca and I had some very long and intense conversations in the wake of Prop 8 about the fact that the communities that we work with, communities of color and faith communities, were deeply targeted in the wake of Prop 8. And so the question was, A, how do we support folks across the country that are experiencing this pain, not only in California, but the backlash was national. So how do we provide that support? And then also, what are the ways that we can model some collaboration that helps to not only move this organizing forward and prevent this from happening in the past, but also provide some healing for our folks who were pretty devastated by this backlash.
So you see the really good intent?
Yes.
So our...
what is that saying, that good intentions pave the way to
that's
hell?
Right.
Yeah,
hell, that's right.
Yeah.
So we gathered the multi-faith body, the National Religious Leadership Roundtable, that consisted of about 25 folks at that point were able to come to the meeting, and probably 16 to 20 leaders, and it was a complete and utter disaster. We gathered them together at a place called the Penn Center, this incredible space that I would recommend to you.
Historic.
Yeah.
Where the civil rights leadership met over and over again, and wow, we had a racial justice explosion there.
Yeah.
In
so
the heart of.
Yeah. And we don't have to go into a lot of detail, but it was all of the racist, anti-religion, mistrust. It was people literally refused to talk to each other, and the groups of folks sat down, and we were in the same dining room, and we were sitting at tables next to each other, and literally no one talked to each other.
Yes.
It was like the worst experience of junior high I've ever, it was just horrible.
It was a hot mess.
Yeah. So part of what we realized from that, and I'm only slightly joking about one of the most important lessons I've learned from some of my mentors is literally some of the best lessons come out of the stupidest mistakes you make. And so Lisa and I embarked on a 18-month, almost 2-year process to try and do things differently, recognizing that it wasn't enough to just say, well, something is wrong, and all we need to do is get people around the same table to talk to each other. Like, that was a naive strategy. And part of what we did was to make the decision that in February of this past year, we were going to do a deeply intersectional, multi-faith gathering at Creating Change, which is a conference of about 2,500 to 3,000 pro-LGBT activists, most of whom identify as secular. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to tell you a little bit now about the process of putting that together and the kind of intentionality that we put together, and just offer it as what it was an amazing experience. And particularly because it came out of such a crappy experience, it was that much better. Mm-hmm. But why don't you tell us a little bit about...
Sure. One of the things that, the context is we had 3 major heartbreaks. We had Prop 8, and then we had, 2, and then the Penn Center. So we were, this was very, very difficult. And so we had to get back on the horse again, which you often have to do in very complex organizing contexts, and figure out what's next. How do we figure this out? And so the lessons learned were really about keeping the longer term in mind, but also how do we actually lay the foundation for trust in relationship building? And this was our biggest question. How were we going to support folks in having this conversation? And one of the things that we realized is that these worlds almost never touch. The activists and leaders in the secular world, particularly in my world, which are activists of color, had very little knowledge of any of the leadership organizations, institutions, organizing experiences, or life stories of anybody in Rebecca's world, including the leaders of color in her faith communities. So even though folks may have been doing work that was similar or overlapping, they did not know one another. And so that was the first big recognition. We thought there may be more overlapping relationships. There were not.
It was crazy.
Yeah, it really, we were stunned to know that the two worlds never, almost rarely ever meet. So that was a big discovery in getting folks together at the Penn Center and part of the clash. So then what we did was we began to think about what a vision for Practice Spirit Do Justice could be, excuse me, based on the knowledge that we had uncovered in this.
Can I say one other thing?
Yeah.
So because there was this lack of a relationship, which, I don't think I can say enough as someone who sort of moves in the world with a relational organizing frame, like that is a huge problem. And so anyway, but the other piece that we did was we engaged in a very intentional educational process with the circles, the 3 circles I told you about that I convene, the Protestants, the cross-Christianity, and the multi-faith body, to do some deeper work and learning around sort of difference in general, but specifically around race and racism, so that there was some degree of a shared frame and analysis to prepare them for a deeply multi-faith intersectional context. So, back to you.
Yes. And I had to have some really intense and intentional conversations with leaders in the racial justice and disability and First Nations communities around faith. There was a deep resistance around faith and even breaking bread with leaders of faith, because faith had been such a painful experience in many of the lives of the folks who are secular leaders in racial, economic justice, disability justice movements. So we started with a vision, and I'll read it because I think the actual words are really important, and then we'll talk about how it actually manifested in terms of the bones of the conference and how we put it together. So this was our vision. We are committed to creating a multi-faith, multiracial conference that does not gloss over the differences along the lines of faith, immigration status, class, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, or age. Rather, our intention is to deeply hold, acknowledge, and learn from our differences as we engage in the transformational work of finding the overlaps in our stories and experiences. We are under no illusion that building this kind of a complex space holds challenges and opportunities, tensions, misunderstandings, lack of information, and all of the isms will be at play as we learn from one another. Our priority is to create a space where respectful, direct, and accountable dialogue can take place throughout our time together. Did you want to add to that? How we arrived there?
Yeah, no, I think we've told you how we arrived there. Yeah.
So then we started to think about, okay, from here, we kind of peeled back the layers of an onion. So we had our values. We really wanted to embody them. So we started to talk about that was our vision. We wanted to embody it, and then we wanted to kind of really pull back the next layer and talk about our values and what was going to guide us in putting together this conference. And one of the primary values was a quote by Gandhi: "Every step towards liberation must have liberation in it." And we had a lot of other values, but that one really seemed to be core to us, because without creating that kind of context for dialogue and engagement, then there would be no basis for trust and respect and motivation for folks to actually spend time getting to know one another. And so that was our top priority with pulling this together, is to follow Gandhi in practice and to really implement and embody our vision statement.
Well, and I think the piece, too, that, again, going back to what is it that religious folks can bring to our kind of secular work, I do think that this sort of Gandhian philosophy, not only about every step must have liberation, step of the liberation must have liberation in it, but there's also this underlying desire to seek out the humanity, both in the sort of those who fit in the oppressor category and those that fit in the oppressed. And so not doing actions that disregard the humanity of the person who you are working, quote unquote, against in that moment.
Mm-hmm. And there's another quote that actually really guided, and we had a first-time People of Color Summit that brought together leaders of color from the secular world and leaders of color from faith communities. And this quote guided our work, but it also guided one of our values for the conference, and I'm going to read it because I think it really was fundamental to our work. Mm-hmm. Quote, "We are taught that the body is an ignorant animal. Intelligence dwells only in the head, but the body is smart. It does not discern between external stimuli and stimuli from the imagination. It reacts equally and viscerally to events from the imagination as it does to real events." And that is from Gloria Anzaldúa. And a lot of our themes for the conference were around body, justice, and community. So
I think can I talk a little bit about the structure? And
yes.
then the question that I would like you all to be meditating on is, in your own particular context, how does this resonate, or what do you have the need to kind of push back against? So be thinking about that. So the only other thing that we would share would be just to sort of talk about trying to work intentionally in the structure of Practice Spirit, Do Justice, because of this sort of three faces of power we told you about earlier, to make sure that our campaigns are rooted in sort of long-term movement building. We spent an entire day exploring together what exactly is our vision, like how ought the world to be? Like the U.S. Social Forum says, another world is possible. Mm-hmm. What is possible? What does it mean to share an intersectional, deeply justice-oriented, pro-LGBT frame? Mm-hmm. And we sort of spent a lot of time the first day with those kinds of exercises together. The second day then came out of that was focused on, okay, how is it that we build organizations that are movement organizations? Like, how do we have organizations that have capacity, whose vision is intersectional, whose strategies are really at the service of this intersectional worldview? And then the last day, not the first day, the last day was, okay, then what ought our campaigning, our mass mobilization, what ought that look like, given the first 2 days? And the other piece that I'll just say one other piece about is, again, going back to this notion of indigenous leadership. We, in the importance of people being from their tradition, talking about LGBT issues within their tradition. We did host this incredible People of Color Summit because of exactly what Lisa said, that there were all of these queer POC religious leaders who simply did not have any relationship, and so we spent an enormous amount of time leading up to that being planful about sort of how does that conversation facilitation happen. But that was a key component to the conference as well. And because the reality is, goes back to Colette's question about, who gets to provide the leadership? It's the organizations that have money, and the organizations that have money are the ones that have larger capacity. They're the ones that it's this completely self-fulfilling, sort of cycle. And the one other piece that we did was we tried to identify 6 different working groups to be kind of partners with us in putting the conference together. Recognizing that there was a Jewish movement building working group, a queer Muslim working group, an African American working group, Asian American Pacific Islander working group, a trans working group, and I'm going to maybe a Latino working group.
Yes.
But again, I guess the last thing to sort of leave you with as we're kind of moving into questions is just the learning for me about have people read Alice Walker's Possessing the Secret of Joy? I don't know if it's really difficult and wonderful book. But one of the end scene, I'll ruin it for you all, but hopefully it won't completely ruin it. There's a woman who prior to her execution, and I'll let you, holds up a sign that says resistance. Resistance is the secret of joy. And part of what I want to kind of leave you with is that in living in a culture in which there are so many intricate and well-formed systems of oppression, if you are one who desires that another world is possible, and from my perspective, I really believe that God calls me to sort of hearken that world, that it takes enormous amounts of intentionality, of planfulness, of strategicness, that resistance is an incredibly important spiritual discipline, if you will, that takes enormous amounts of forethought and preparation and planning.
And I'll leave you with, just a kind of an anecdote, I think, from our working experience. We had several difficulties and challenges and at times failures in trying to do this. And one of the things that I have learned around the three faces of power is that at the base building stage, at that early stage when a new frame like rights is forming, we want to cast our net wide because we want to find as many of our people in the we as possible. But when we start moving into the infrastructure building stage and building organizations and money and competition and things like that and organizational mission statements start to become part of the equation, that's when we actually began to narrow the we. And I think what Rebecca and I are trying to do with our work is in this new movement moment, there's a new frame emerging. We are moving from the rights frame. It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we're moving from a rights frame to a much more interdependent and intersectional frame. Most movement historians and theorists believe that that's where we're going. And at the beginning of this base building stage, which is a long period of time, it's usually the first decade, a little bit more, what Rebecca and I are trying to do is make an intervention now at the base building stage so that as we move into this intersectional frame and it becomes institutionalized, that as money starts to come into the equation and competition, that then all the good work that we've been trying to do to build relationship doesn't fall apart, because then, again, we're back to narrowing the we. And that's, I think, what we're struggling with is, and why we keep getting back on the horse, is we have a window of time to really make a difference here before the movement really institutionalizes this frame and starts to narrow it and attach a lot of funding to it and really begin to start severing the relationships. And the thing is, the stronger the relationships are in the early stages, the harder it is to sever them later down the road. So that's where the urgency for this comes in. And I think that's why even when we fail, we keep getting back on the horse and doing it.
Amen.
So there you have it. That's our little anecdote. But we'd love to take some questions.
Yeah.
Very good.
So I would go back to the question I posed. What resonates in your particular context? What resonates with what we've shared? Or what things would you push back at?
And
Yes,
do we
please.
need to rotate the mic, or will it pick up on the tape if we don't rotate it? Should I move the mic around? Okay, great. I'll do that. Okay, hold on. I'm coming for you.
Oprah, or I guess Phil Donahue.
I'm coming for you.
So I'm a social justice and LGBT rights activist in Grand Rapids, and I really appreciate the thrust of your message, that you're bringing your analysis to bear on the notion that we need to be increasingly and more sophisticatedly intersectional in the work that we're doing. And we try mightily and flail mightily at doing that work here. So there was one message that I want to push back and ask you about a little bit, and that is, when you started, you were talking about what I heard was Christianity is the problem. And the thing that I want to push back on a little bit is that we struggle with that, saying we want to target where we can have the most effect, right? Christianity is the problem. And at the same time, we don't want to reify the notion that Christianity is the center of everything. We want to center heterosexism and center the fact that, for instance, I grew up not in the church, and boy, I faced a lot of homophobia, and it wasn't from the church directly. I understand that it's messy. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of ask about that.
That's a great point. And, we could probably spend the rest of the day chewing over this together. So let me just share a bit. Two pieces that come to me. One is that it's extraordinarily important to do work within every single religious tradition, because that sort of sin peg that I talked about earlier is present in varying degrees in every religious tradition. So I don't want to downplay that importance. However, I think the reality is that as much as we value the separation of church and state in this culture, we have been shaped by Christian values, and that to pretend that this is not a culture that has been deeply influenced by Christianity, I think would not be wise. And so, again, I don't want to be simplistic about this, because I also feel like the resources for transforming this situation are deeply present in a variety of religious traditions, including Christianity. But I do think that because the Christians make up the vast majority of the population, and the ways in which the mores and the values and the language that are kind of public square, that happen in the public square, are deeply influenced by the Christian tradition, that it's really important to make sure that, one example is that, I watched this extraordinarily painful conversation between Elizabeth Birch and Jerry Falwell, and it was like, oh Lord, that was when Elizabeth Birch was the head of the Human Rights Campaign, and it was this horrifying missing of one another, and so the incredible importance to be able to name what I would call fundamentalism and false fundamentalism that gets trotted out as political language, but in fact is, in my opinion, the worst part of Christianity. So that's what I mean, that I think there has to be wisdom about really, it wasn't, the anti-LGBT Buddhists who funded Proposition 8. It was the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church, like that's the reality of who, the language and it's not that there doesn't need to be work within Orthodox Judaism, for instance, but in terms of the secular context, that's a huge influence. Does that help sort of nuance what I said?
Yeah, in the second part of what you were saying, I was relieved. I thought, she's not saying Christianity is the center. Exactly. Yeah. So, yes, and I think we should just be careful about saying that, because I think it disenfranchises the community. Yeah. But the other piece is that we're organizing some dialogues right now. We do multicultural dialogue, and right now we're working on a race dialogue in one community, a sexual orientation dialogue in another, and we're sort of struggling with the third, which is going to be located in a large independent liberal church. And we're thinking about the idea of experimenting with dialogue between believers and non-believers. Cool. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or reactions to that.
Well, one thought is that Lisa and I actually have spent quite a bit of time, is that in terms of the sort of, what I might say, those who practice religion and those who, who have strong beliefs but they're not religious beliefs, that helping to sort of have a conversation that's really rooted in values, because I think there's this sort of disdain that can happen from religious folks that, atheist means completely without value. And my experience is that some of my atheist friends are the most clear about their values than some of my Christian friends who are just, well, that's because of the way it's supposed to be. And so, finding what are the common value, having some conversation about the common and the different values, and what does it mean to live in a pluralistic culture as, this whole question of separation of church church and state and how we live into that. I've had really rich dialogues with both of those pieces. Yeah. Other reactions to or pushbacks from?
Thank you. I represent Holland P-Flag. And one of the things that we struggle to push back against is the religious closed-mindedness, whether it be from the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Christian community, in which so often they use their ignorance and they use their religious writings to enforce the bigotry that they come up with. And it's so hard, no matter what community you come from, to fight against that. Mm-hmm. It's just the closed-mindedness. They read what they want to read. They interpret it the way they want to interpret it. And it's so hateful. And it's hard to get beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have a couple of things that come to me, and Lisa, feel free to chip in if you think of things. One of the pieces is that Lisa and I, as we were walking around the track this morning, we're reflecting on was that the way in which fundamentalism plays a role, at least in the three monotheistic traditions, that and recognizing Karen Armstrong has written some lovely things, The History of God, for instance, in which she talks about sort of what she would identify as sort of the core of the three monotheistic traditions and the distortion that fundamentalism does to that core. So just, I think, recognizing when we're behaving in fundamentalist ways. But I think that the other piece that we're going to talk about later on today in another context, I often think we aren't super nuanced in our relational organizing. I think it's just critically important that these kinds of conversations aren't sort of intellectual conversations, but they're really grounded in relationship. And a nuance on that, the Unitarians do in their welcoming processes, they have this bullseye that, 1 is at the center, 2 is the next one, 3, and then 4. And they have, they really encourage local congregations to do an analysis of who are the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s in their congregation. And then when they do a welcoming process, they never recommend that a 1, and the 1 would be somebody who's a complete supporter of LGBT issues, for instance. They never ask a 1 have a conversation with a 4. Their basic theory is you only have conversation with the developmental stage right next to you. So 1s talk to 2s, 2s talks to 1 and 3s, 3s talks to 2 and 4s. But that, part of, again, the whole Elizabeth Birch, Jerry Falwell is, if we are so radically far apart that all we do is reify these differences, but and it kind of goes back to the indigenous leadership piece as well. Like, we were talking about the Church of the Nazarene last night. They are not going to be talking to this out lesbian UCC pastor about anything, like the color of the trash bags. But if Paul is having conversation, that's a really different relationship and context. So, I think that sort of using some of the wisdom around relational organizing can be helpful. And I think the other piece though is from my own tradition, there's this thing of like you reach out, you try and have the conversation, and then if it's not happening, you kick the dust off your feet and you move on. And sort of recognizing, I think as a good liberal, I always no, I want to keep in relationship, but that's not a good stewardship of my time and energy. And so recognizing, that discernment about, what conversations are worth having. I don't know if does that resonate?
Can I just flesh out one quick thing that you're saying? Because again, when we were walking around the track this morning, we were talking about how do you map a community, so that one of the things, the challenges we have is that we often jump into dialogue, which is important, and yet at times when we map the community, for example, using that bullseye, we may decide I may not be the best person to have this conversation, but so-and-so, either in the denomination, in the church, in the community, may be a better person and may be able to move the conversation a little further because this person's a 1 and I'm a 4, or vice versa, right? So it's about how we map our communities and effectively have those hard conversations in order to move things. And I think sometimes our genuine hope is that dialogue will get us there, and yet at times we may not be the right match for that dialogue. So it's about how do we have some organizing strategy around who we talk to and how.
And one other point to that, there's some really exciting research that's happened here, actually in Michigan, around messaging, around pro-LGBT religious messages in particular, and generally speaking pro-LGBT messages. And one of the key findings, and this is, again, is that messenger is, if not more important, at least equally important to message. And that, I think I'm just going to your point.
Should we take one more question? Do we have a little bit more time? Okay, all right, great. I think I saw a hand here. Did I? And then, did you have your hand up? I think you did for a while.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then I'll come back.
A couple things that come to mind are, the man up in front used the words closed-minded, hateful, and bigoted. All right, and by using that kind of language, are we not trying to define the people that we're trying to talk with? And then are we not judging them before we've even talked to them? And is that going to, in turn, make them judge us and shut down the whole communication process?
Well, that goes back to this kind of Gandhian, methodology of how do you hearken to the humanity in the other person. One story, I keep tipping my hand for what I'm due later on in the day, but hopefully not, you all won't be there. But one example is, we do a lot of work in the Lutheran Church, and there was a council that was seeking to begin a reconciling in Christ is the name of the process in the Lutheran Church. And there was a PFLAG mom who was a total ardent supporter of it, and there was this young guy, straight guy, who was like, over my dead body are we starting this process? And they spent 3 council meetings, and if any of you all have spent any time in church councils, you know of what I speak, arguing and just butting heads. And finally, the PFAG mom said, you know what? Can you and I get together in the narthex, the area kind of next to the sanctuary, next Sunday after church, and will you bring a picture of your family? So the next Sunday they did this, and the PFLAG mom came with her one picture. The guy came with a grocery bag filled with pictures of his family. And they spent an entire hour together, the first 55 minutes of which were her sitting there, and he just took out picture after picture after picture. And what emerged was, it wasn't that he was necessarily flaming anti-LGBT. He was exhausted. He was a young dad, and he was terrified that a welcoming process would take energy and time and resources away from his desperate need to be supported in church. And the act of being listened to by her meant that, and then from there on out, she asked him questions. And as an older mom and had experience as a parent, she became a sort of support person and mentor to him. And he didn't change his views completely, but he chose to step aside and allow the process to move forward. So that's that.
He was being listened to instead of talked at.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
My question was in regards to Proposition 8, and I came here from California. Being a member of the LGBT community, my frustration is that you talk about political campaigning, and for me, I saw, I moved here from San Francisco, so I saw a very different view. My frustration is the apathy within our community and the complacency that this will never happen, this won't happen, we're evolved, we'll never go there. And then, boom, it occurs, and we're filled with rage and anger.
And what I would like to hear from you is, what are the methodologies to promote a more unified, strengthened form of campaigning, awareness, and not taking for granted that, oh, we're San Francisco, this will never happen, surprise, you know.
Do you want to answer that one first?
So I think that, Kenyon Farrow was here last month, and he talked a lot about, kind of how the policy agenda gets set in the broader movement nationally. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that the way that the LGBT national agenda, policy and political agenda gets set is, again, with that narrowing. The narrower, the win is defined by narrowing the we. And unfortunately, apathy, I think, creeps in because this is not a broad-based political organizing and movement-building agenda that resonates across our communities. The reason why, and I keep going back to the March on Washington, if you haven't read John D'Amelio's book called The Lost Prophet on the life and history of Bayard Rustin, it's really a great read. And one of the important things about framing the March on Washington is that it was in 1963 about jobs and justice and economics and freedom. And because the frame was broad enough, it resonated across communities. It resonated, and so masses of people came out to support the values and the frame of the march because the movement at the time was framed broadly enough because it was more in that base building stage rather than that institutionalized stage. The LGBT movement right now is like, an ocean liner, turning it around and trying to have a bigger frame that resonates across our LGBT communities is really tough because the thing that keeps those ocean liners moving in one direction is money. The money, the power, and the institutionalizing of the agenda. And unfortunately, because of that, the agenda that's in place nationally only resonates with a very small portion of our communities. And so that's why we have apathy. I think that if the LGBT movement was serious about resonating across communities, both in their campaign and their organizing work, they would be sitting down with and actually deeply, intentionally sharing power with all the communities that they've pushed to the margin of the movement in order to win the narrow win. Okay, so that's just my cheap 2 cents on it. But
no, that's great. I would resonate with everything you said.
Great.
It's really wise at times when you're working with, when you have the brilliance of a colleague, you just don't say anything else.
Yeah, back at you. So I think we're wrapping up. Do you want to close with some parting thoughts for us?
No, I just really, I don't have any other additional wisdom other than to just offer a word of gratitude to each of you for taking this time out of your day and thinking and kind of discerning with both of us and offering us the opportunity to share a bit about our life experience and wisdom. And I just wish you the best. Everything I've heard about GVSU makes me want to actually live here and come here. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, teacher.